Hello, everybody. I hope you're doing well. I am so happy to introduce our guest today, Professor Stephen Hicks. He's a heavyweight in the world of philosophy and influential thinker, teacher, and author. Dr. Hicks has written thought-provoking books like Explaining Postmodernism, which we have in Hebrew, translated, you should buy it immediately, Nietzsche and the Nazis, The Art of Reasoning. He is also a senior scholar at the Atlas Society, where he shares his insights about freedom, ethics, reason, and through Peterson Academy, he is teaching two wonderful courses on philosophy to help even more people connect with these ideas. So, Dr. Hicks, thank you very much for joining us. It's a
Well,
real pleasure to have you here.
well, thanks for this invitation. I'm honored to be here.
Thank you. So the stage is yours. You're going to stay to start with 10 minutes of like general remarks, right?
Hmm. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, in our correspondence back and forth, Harry, and leading up to this, you had mentioned wanting to know kind of a philosophy perspective on what's going on in the world. And the world is a big place. Philosophy is a big place. So that's great. But what I thought I would start was by focusing on trying to figure out, say, the last year and a half of events. Now, I notice you are Israeli, and Israel has been at the center of everything in the world for the last year and a half for pro and con. And as it always is, there are some individuals or some places or some events that serve as the touchstone or the trigger point for discussions of everything. And when we start talking about everything, people's philosophical perspectives do come out. So I thought an illuminating thing as I've been thinking through this is particularly since in my career, I'm a professor. I've been inside the academy for my entire career at universities in Canada and the United States, and then a couple of European universities as visiting positions. And there always has been special attention given to Israel of all of the, as we think of them, smaller nations of the world. So if you think of the heavyweight nations, so to speak, you think China, you think United States, you think perhaps Russia, you think of the European Union, and then you have a smaller country in terms of population that seems to have an outsized amount of attention directed to it, and that's Israel. And this is often by people who don't never been to Israel. They may not be able to find it on the map, but nonetheless they have heated opinions about what should be or should not be done. And this percolates not only among the professoriate, but also students have an opinion on, should a university or their university have some of its investment be in companies that are also investing in Israel and so on. So the thing that I think is striking about this is that when you start to look at the people who are pro-Israel in general and anti-Israel in general, they fall into different subcategories fairly quickly. For most people in the West, and I would say just thinking of the West as anything to the west of Israel, so that would include all of Europe, North America, and then as you further go even further to the west, you would include Australia, New Zealand, and so on. Is that Israel, to the extent of those people who are in favor of it or like Israel, they see it as a normal, modern, decent society. So it's a place where it's a kind of democratic republic. Yes, there is a strong religious component involved in the founding, and that is historically understandable, right? Why that ethnic and religious component was there at the beginning. But then at the same time, a recognition that Israel is largely secular in its political philosophy and its culture. Many people are, of course, Jewish religiously, but there are other practicing religions that are allowed to practice there. So it's a place of religious toleration. People have the vote, and a large number of people are secular and more culturally Jewish or culturally Arabic or whatever it is. It also is a country that has great achievements in science and technology. So it's part of the kind of the modern Enlightenment project, so to speak. And just as the modern Enlightenment began in Europe, spread to North America, so it's part of the world that is progressive in that sense. It's in favor of science, technology, individual freedoms. It participates in the broader free market, the global economy, practices religious toleration, has meaningful democracy, a certain level of government corruption, and so on, but it's more or less at ordinary levels. So Israel then is just part of that package. But what makes Israel interesting is that it, in one sense, punches above its weight because it's relatively small, geographically small in terms of population, but nonetheless it has what seems to be an outsized impact. When you turn to the other side of the divide, it becomes messy very quickly. That you mention Israel and you start to get very strong negative reactions. And then you try to figure out what's behind that negative reaction. You have all sorts of things that come out, and it's not clear that it's coming from any sort of a unified place. And I think the thing that's been helpful to me is to start identifying the enemies of Israel in terms of the order of generality, because if we start at the smallest level of generality, for example, there are people who are opposed to Israel. And when you talk with them, they don't think that it should exist as a political state. So that then is to say that they've got some objections to the way in which Israel came into existence as a political unit. Right? And so it's a particular country, and the fact that it's Jewish and so forth is of secondary concern. They genuinely are just anti-Israel for various reasons. But there's a larger group, I think, of people who are then opposed to Israel because, like lots of other states that happen to be formed as a result of happenstance in history, it is a Jewish state identified. And it's the Jewishness and the predominance of Judaism in this particular state that is clearly pushing their buttons negatively. So it's not a political reason, but rather it's a religious reason. And so the explanation here, just as there's a long, long history of people who dislike Jews or outright hate the Jews for religious reasons, and we still have, even though we're in the 21st century, huge numbers of people in the world who are in that category. So historical, political reasons, and then religious reasons. Another large contingent, though, are people who are not particularly animated by Israel's political history. They don't even know particularly what Judaism is. They're not particularly religious themselves, but they are opposed to Israel. And when you push them, it is because Israel is an ally of the United States. And so the anti-Israel sentiment is downstream from their being opposed to the United States, right? So the United States in this analysis is the big brother. Israel is a little brother, right? Or the United States is the world power and it's protecting Israel. So anything that from their perspective attacks Israel is indirectly attacking the United States, and that's what they are really interested in. Now, then we have to say, well, now we're scaling out and we're not necessarily talking about religion anymore. Why are so many people, and now in the intellectual world, opposed to the United States? And then you start to get an even broader category of reasons. There are lots of people who are opposed to the United States just for general global rivalry reasons. So now that we're on the internet, part of one big, huge community, there are huge numbers of people who are pro-Russia or pro-China. And their understanding of the world is that it's basically the United States versus China versus Russia. Those are the major players. And because we have a huge number of people now participating in the international discussion who are pro-Russia or pro-China, the downstream order of thinking is whatever attacks the United States is good for Russia, or whatever attacks China or United States is good for China. And Israel is part of the United States' gambit. So anything that is bad for Israel is bad for the United States and therefore good for this favor. So it's then part of the long game of geopolitical rivalry, and Israel is further downstream. Now, I think that's understandable if you think of people who are increasingly entering into the discussion, who are Sinophiles or Russophiles or so forth. The ones that are closer now to my area of professional expertise are people who were born in Canada, say, like I was, and got their education in Canada, or born in the United States or Australia. And those people who are part of, so to speak, broadly American or Western civilization, who would more normally, as most of us do, think of ourselves as allies to the American project, those people who are anti-US. And here again, we have a large number of sub-ideological contingents at different levels. For some people, we know their political and economic commitments are to some sort of socialism, to some sort of communism. They might be out explicitly Marxist. And there are huge contingents of Marxists and neo-Marxists and socialists of various sorts in the West. The way it works for them is the United States is the big capitalist nation, and it's the symbolic leader of the capitalist world. And since they are ideologically committed to some sort of anti-capitalism, they are opposed to the United States, even if they are a part of it. And inside the academy, it's hard to overestimate the number of people who are in that contingent. And then again, Israel seems to be downstream. Israel is a semi-capitalist kind of nation, but again, it's part of the global, more open economy. And so the things are down there. Also, the United States is then not just economically, but it's the symbolic leader of the free world, not just free market economics, but religious toleration, equality of men and women, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's a beacon of liberalism, but we have a huge number of intellectual movements very prominently placed that are anti-liberal. They're in favor of some sort of authoritarianism, whether it's on the far left or the far right, whether it's some kind of paternalism or whatever. And again, Israel is somewhat downstream from that because it's, broadly speaking, a liberal democratic nation, religious toleration, and so forth. So it's a target for that reason. And then there are others who are becoming more philosophically, and it's not just the United States that they are opposed to, but their enemy is the entire Western project as they see it. When I was finishing graduate school, and there was a round in the 1990s of large-scale student protests all over at campuses. The famous chant was not just "burn the American flag," right, as it had been at other protests and so forth, or call for divestment from Israel and so forth. Instead, it was quite explicitly, and here was the chant was, hey, ho, Western Civ has got to go. And so that then is to say all of Western civilization, which had informed by and large the university curriculum and then the curriculum of K through 12 education, that was the target because it embodied what it saw as Western values. And so that then is to say everything that not just the United States and North America and Europe and Australia and now Japan and New Zealand and so forth stand for, that entire project is wrong. That modern Enlightenment project is wrong, and that is what has to go. And there's some heavy-duty intellectuals and philosophers who are behind that movement. Now we're scaling out from kind of Israel as a political unit to Judaism to to capitalism to liberalism to America to Western civilization. There is another strong component of this, though, that is, I think of it, this is a pejorative term, but I'm willing to argue for it, that is outright nihilistic. That is to say, it's destruction for its own sake. And it's not that these achievements are Western achievements, but any sorts of achievements. And so it will attack the idea that China has a great ancient civilization or Japan has a great ancient civilization. It's the idea that civilization itself is suspect. So these are the kinds of people who, for example, want to blow up industrial factories, the kinds of people who are willing to destroy precious works of art, who want to undercut and abolish all classical music, for example. And it's quite clear that what they are opposed to is the idea that these are great cultural and civilizational achievements that we should be celebrating, that instead it purely is a destructive and nihilistic movement. And when you ask them what that should be replaced with, they don't have an answer. Instead, they revert to the negative. So there are those, and there's a significant number of those who, for whatever psychological or cultural reasons, are extraordinarily negative, and they have in many cases, a well worked out ideology that justifies that destructiveness for its own sake. So my area of expertise, though, as a philosopher and a kind of a historian of ideas, has been to focus on the various strands of increasing levels of abstraction, kind of anti-civilizational philosophies, and how they have put together their various arguments and become mobilized in movements. But since these are primarily intellectuals doing this work, coming up with the ideas, putting them together in packages, and then teaching the next generation of activists who are going to go out and put them out, you find them, that a disproportionate number of them are philosophers. And in many cases, these arguments are developed over the course of a generation, put together in a package before they're put into place. So the people who are anti-capitalist, the people who are anti-liberal, people who are opposed to free speech and the free range of discussion, people who are opposed to the United States for symbolic reasons, to Western civilization, and so on. That's my area of expertise. So I suppose my two biggest books have been the ones that have come focusing on, if you take like a standard political spectrum, I don't think this is a good spectrum, but it's a standard one where you say there's the far right, and people like Hitler and the National Socialists and the fascists are on the far right. And then if you go to the other end of the spectrum, the far left, you have various kinds of socialism and communism and Marxism and so forth. So my two books have been focusing on the philosophies on the far left and on the far right, and how they were first formulated by philosophers and then formulated movements that weaponize those ideas in the ongoing attack. And where we are right now is, I think, Israel, for various reasons. It's not only the kind of the anti-civilization, anti-American, anti-Western ideas, ideologists, that they are now forming coalitions with people who have more local concerns. They just would like to see Israel not exist for various sorts of geopolitical reasons, or they would like to see Jews not exist for various religious reasons. So we have a coalition of some very old traditional movements and some more recent high-tech intellectual movements coming together, and Israel is in the crosshairs. So that's my assessment of where we are right now, and it's meant to be a sobering assessment because the territory is extraordinarily complicated, and there's not, so to speak, just one anti-Israel or anti-Jew or anti-American target that we can point out, focus our enemies there. It's a multi-focus that we need to have, and that makes it both intellectually difficult and strategically difficult to wrap one's mind around.
Thank you. So since you mentioned America as the big brother, America is basically the foot of the Enlightenment. And
Yes.
Yes, and I would like for you to describe, if you can, what changed during the time of the Enlightenment. Who were the main philosophers who actually changed this drastic approach to life and putting the individual as a moral agency in the center of the social order? And if you can then explain which kind of currents and anti-Enlightenment philosophers do you recognize, and how do we recognize how they weaponize basically their philosophies against our standing as responsible individual in a civil society?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, that's a very rich question. The Enlightenment, as a label, philosophers and historians use, essentially refers to the 1700s, or sometimes it'll be a little bit earlier and a little bit later. That was perhaps the most revolutionary century ever in human history in terms of new ideas, and those new ideas being institutionalized in practice. Now, part of it certainly is what you mentioned, Harry, the rise of individualism in moral philosophy. That is to say, the individual has value. That you don't belong to the king, you don't
Mhm.
belong to your aristocrat, you don't belong to a tribe, right? That has ownership of you. You don't even necessarily belong to your family, right? The job of your family is to raise individuals who will have their own ideas and their own values and go out and independently make their own way in the world. And that was a radical idea that started first in Western Europe in the latter part of the 1600s. And so the idea politically that individuals have rights, and that forceful set of language, you have a right to your own life. You're not owned by the king. You are not owned by your father. You are not owned by anybody. You're a self-owning, as the language often is. That you should have individual freedom to go into whatever career you choose, to choose your own friends, to choose your own religion, to choose where in the world you want to live, to choose whom you're going to marry, whether you're going to have children, and so forth. That all of these are functions of the individual. And then the other piece of language here is, the pursuit of happiness, right? Is that you should strive to live a happy life, a fulfilling life. That you're not here as a servant of the king, or that you can be sacrificed for the good of some other being, and that your life is a bunch of duties and so on. The first big battles over this were precisely over religious issues. That the idea is that you're born into a certain state, and so whatever the king's religion is, or whatever the government has decided the religion is, you have to have that religion. Or that you're born into a certain family, or you're born into a certain church, and you just inherit their religion. That instead, the idea that you should make an effort to study the religious texts, study religious history, study the different religions, consider the arguments for and the existence against the existence of God and the various religions, and make up your own individual mind about what your religion is going to be. Now, we take this more or less for granted now that we are a couple of centuries later, but that was radical and revolutionary during the Enlightenment. Another part of the individualism, and again, is to think about the status of women, which was, as we know, all over the world for tens of thousands of years. Women, they might be valued to some extent as individuals, but they are subordinate to the male, they're subordinate to the king, they're subordinate to their families, they don't have choices, they don't necessarily get as much education. That women also should be seen as individuals who have freedom to govern their own lives and so forth. That is also a new idea in the 1700s. Also, if you take the idea of slavery, it's shocking for us now to think that basically until the 1600s, it's hard to find anybody who has a problem with slavery morally. Nobody wanted to be a slave, really. But it was seen as either natural. If you lose a battle or you get captured, of course you're going to be made a slave, and maybe it's part of God's purpose for the world, because you don't find much in any of the religious scriptures. It seems to be opposed on principle to slavery. But then, as part of this individualism that you're flagging absolutely rightly, to say that no, slaves are human beings. And so they too should have the same basic rights that all human beings have. And so, for the first time in history, in Western European nations and in the early United States, you start to see movements formed to eliminate slavery, to educate people, to get rid of the laws that support, and even in some cases, military action. And then in the course of a century or so, slavery is largely eliminated. So the idea here, though, is that we are now doing religion very differently. We're thinking about women and slavery very differently, and it's happening in a very fast time. Now, also part of the Enlightenment project is a more scientific understanding of the way of thinking about the world, that the world is cause and effect. It's not all miracles. It's not mysterious and divine forces and weird things that can happen. And who are we to question these things? There's a notion that the world is natural. It goes by cause and effect. We have a very powerful mind that we can develop tools like mathematics and experimental methods to figure out the way the world works. And that is an intellectual revolution. And so all of what we now think of as the modern sciences, physics coming on board in the 1600s. So Galileo and Isaac Newton and Robert Hooker, chemistry, biology, and the formation of all of the major branches of the sciences are occurring 1600s on into the 1700s and maturing. So part of the Enlightenment then is to say that we, whether you think there's a God behind it all or not, that's certainly a follow-up question worth pursuing, but that we are competent to figure out the way the world works, and then to take that knowledge and empower ourselves, devise new machines, industrial revolution, which is also part of the Enlightenment, 1700s, to transform how we interact with the world in various ways. So scientifically, technologically, religiously, the status of women, getting rid of slavery, this idea of individual rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all of that put together is the Enlightenment project. And it also was extraordinarily optimistic as it came together, that we should not be here to suffer and die short lives. We should be here to figure stuff out, make our lives better, and live a flourishing life. And we can make the world a better place, solve all of the major problems, and pass the world on to our children and grandchildren better than we left it. That was shocking and revolutionary, and much of that was accomplished in just a little over a century. Now, that's the Enlightenment. The second part of your question was then to say, well, what about the counter-Enlightenment or the anti-Enlightenment? And yes, part of the story has been that over the course of the last couple of centuries, as the Enlightenment was coming along, it then fairly quickly, this is a bit simplistic, but it encountered two kinds of enemies right away. There were those who said, look, this Enlightenment is challenging traditional beliefs. It's challenging traditional institutions, right? It seems like it asks us to question the existence of God, or the establishment of various religious hierarchies, or you're going to free all of the slaves, and what's that going to do to society? Or suddenly we're going to have women demanding all sorts of things. It's too much, it's too fast. The old ways of doing things are the correct ways of doing things. We should not be changing. These are dangerous ideas. And what we either need to do is suppress these dangerous new ideas, or if we can't suppress them, then we need to take the old ideas and make them better so that they can fight against these new modern Enlightenment ideas. So what has happened also is then people who have a more traditional philosophy have become more sophisticated over the course of the last centuries in wanting to attack or at least moderate much of the trends of the Enlightenment philosophy. So that's one road. And what you will then find is then smart, articulate people, but defending views that have been around for thousands of years in the modern world. And I would say to come back to Israel in particular, one of the big challenges then is that Israel is largely a modernized Enlightenment project nation. So you see, they want to live a good life. It's a very science and technology and religious tolerance and equal women and so forth kind of nation. And it is surrounded by, in many cases, not necessarily nations, although some of them are nations, but cultures that are committed to a philosophy that says all of those values are wrong. So it's not just the Jewishness, it's the fact about how they treat women, right? It's the fact that they are bought into science and technology and that they are doing so much better economically. And they want to then revive ancient philosophies because they want to resist that onslaught of Israel as the point guard in the Middle East for modern Enlightenment kinds of values. Now, at the same time, though, the other major enemy, though, was those who wanted to say, look, the modern Enlightenment world is a fact, and we don't believe in the old religious philosophies, and we don't want to go back to the old ways of doing things. But nonetheless, we are opposed to the modern Enlightenment. We don't think that science is good. We don't think that technology is good. And it's not because we want to replace that with old-fashioned religion. Right? We think, for example, that science is just another kind of intellectual regime that wants to tell us what to do, that it's going to become conjoined with political powers that be, and we're going to have instead of a dictatorship of old-fashioned religious figures, we're going to have a dictatorship of scientist kings who are going to try to control us and push our buttons in various ways. So these are people then who don't like pre-modern religions. They also don't like modern science because they see both of those as intellectual regimes that are necessarily going to try to control us. So from their perspective, you have to be anti anything that progresses science or progresses the technological project. Another big part, though, of this anti-Enlightenment regime comes more directly out of politics, though. As we got away from feudalism, kings and aristocrats and all of that, American Revolution, French Revolution, Britain's Glorious Revolution, and we start then moving the world into a more democratic and republican kind of direction, away from feudalism, away from tribalism. Much of the West said we should be individualistic, as you were suggesting in the early question, and we should talk about freedom of religion and freedom in business and free market capitalism, and freedom becomes the most important word for the individual. This approach was to say, well, we don't think we should be individualistic. And it's not because we want to go back to aristocracy or everybody serving the king or women knowing their place in the church or the synagogue and following the male direction, but it's that we think people should be socialistic rather than individualistic, or they should be communistic, right, rather than free market capitalistic. So we have a number of people now in the modern world, and initially they were a minority, who are then committed to some sort of radical egalitarianism or some sort of communism, and sometimes a revolutionary violent form of communism. And so they are then politically opposed to the modern Enlightenment world that seems to be moving in a much more liberal, individualistic, capitalistic direction. They would like to destroy all of that or transform all of that into some sort of communistic, idealized, socialistic version, even if it requires a political revolution. So they would then, for example, be opposed both to the pre-moderns who want to go back and the moderns who want to, and the Enlightenment who wants to go in an individualistic, capitalistic direction and to have some sort of socialistic revolution or communistic revolution. Now, from their perspective, though, the modern world has been largely a great series of disappointments because All of the socialist revolutions and socialist experiments that have been tried have by and large been failures. Some of them have been disastrous failures. Many of them have been plagued with human rights violations on a massive, massive scale. But nonetheless, these are individuals in each generation who think, I still think that socialism is an ideal despite all of these failures. And what we just need is a new anti-enlightenment, anti-individualist, anti-capitalist political strategy. So if we can destroy the modern capitalist world, in some way we can have another chance at doing socialism better the next time. So those people are increasingly articulate. Many of them are in the academy, in the intellectual world. So as I would say right now, we are faced intellectually then at this level of abstraction with a three-way debate. There are those who are essentially modern, individualistic, scientific. Technology is net beneficial for society. Let's continue with that Enlightenment project. And then there's two kinds of counter-Enlightenment philosophies. Those who want to say we need to go back to the old way of doing things in a more sophisticated version of traditional philosophies, and this usually means traditional religious philosophies. And those who are neither religious nor scientific, who want to say we need to destroy the Enlightenment and take things in a postmodern direction towards some sort of collectivized or socialized regime. So that's I will pause there. There's a lot more information to digest, obviously.
Yes, it's a lot. If I'm not mistaken, a proper system of philosophy would begin with the nature of reality, metaphysics, and then epistemology, and then ethics, and eventually it will lead to politics, and then to even arts, aesthetics, right?
I think so, yes. Although
So,
just one friendly amendation, I would think you need to do the metaphysics and epistemology simultaneously. So
mhm,
by metaphysics, we mean you have some understanding of what you take reality to be. Right? Is
yes.
it the natural world or is it a supernatural world? Is it finite in time or is it eternal? Finite in space? Is it cause and effect or is it unintelligible or full of miracles and mysteries and so on? That's your metaphysical orientation. But
And
simultaneously, if you're a thoughtful person, you have to be able to say, well, how do you know that? Right? How do you validate that? Or why do you believe those things? And that takes you to epistemology, which is the study of knowledge.
mhm.
So,
So my question is
yeah,
basically, in order to attack the enlightenment, they had to actually go against our understanding of reality, to go
yeah,
against the senses, to detach us from reality. Can
yes,
you speak about that? Because I think that once they do that, they put us in some kind of secondary reality, and then they
yes,
can basically throw to us any kind of narrative and
sure.
influence
No,
our mind without us having any foundations.
no, that's exactly right. So if you take the modern Enlightenment project, it will say we start with nature. Nature is real, and nature operates according to cause and effect principles. And then how do you know that? Well, I observe it with my senses. I have five senses that are points of contact with the natural world. And then we go on to do various sophisticated things to figure out more broadly, conceptually, in terms of scientific principles and laws, how all of that works. Now, if you are going to attack that, right, then the natural starting point would be to say, well, if you think your senses are your basic point of contact with nature, you attack the senses. And so what you will then do as a philosophical skeptic is say, well, the senses can't put us in contact with reality. So we might say, for example, I don't know, I'm standing on top of a table. Imagine some slightly strange situation. I'm looking down at the table, and I say to my eyes, it looks like this table is a square with four right angles, triangles. But you are standing off to the side looking at the table, and you would say, well, from my perspective, it looks like a parallelogram, and the angles are a little bit different. They're not 90-degree angles.
Mhm.
And they would say, well, they have your senses are telling you one thing, my senses are telling me a different thing. Therefore, and now we reach the skeptical conclusion, it can't be that you are seeing a table, a real table. It must be that you have a subjective image in your mind that you're paying attention to, and I have a subjective image in my mind that I'm paying attention to, but then everybody's going to have their own subjective images, and no one can say that their images is correct about reality. So then you can say, well, we're just in some sort of subjective reality. And then lots of downstream things are there. Well, if you're in your subjective reality, you can't then build up your science and say that your science is truer than my science. Right? And so science then starts to be suspect in various ways. Now, that's just one not very good skeptical argument, but it is the kind of argument that one will make. And if from the get-go, all of these skeptical arguments are ones that philosophers need to take seriously, but there are also people who are interested in attacking science from the beginning for whatever reason. Right? They have a religion or they have a political agenda that science won't let them believe. Right? So they need to attack science in some way. They go looking for these kinds of skeptical arguments that will put the Enlightenment people and the scientific people on the defensive, so they can set those arguments aside and believe whatever other philosophy they want.
Mm-hmm. I would like to ask something. If we take the enlightened, if we understand that reality exists, that A is A, we can eventually look at the environment and we can see that this environment supports our life. It's in that kind of environment we can see human beings, and eventually by observing all of that based
Yes.
on observation and evidence, you can come to the conclusion that people actually do exist, something that people might actually challenge today. And when you see that they actually exist, the next thing that you have to accept is that they own themselves. Nobody else can claim ownership on some other individual. So would you also agree that part of the war on individualism and liberty and freedom is to basically destroy the understanding of reality as it is and the existence of human beings, so that we can basically take away their sense of ownership and give it to some kind of collective ideologies?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. If you want to say we can observe reality and things are what they are, and then your line of argument, I think, is correct. Is, well, who is doing the observing? You say, well, it's the individual who has his or her own mind observing reality. And then upstream from that is going to be, well, then I need to trust and respect the individual's judgment about reality. Since the individual is the agent acting on the basis of his or her judgment of reality, you get certain political conclusions. So, yes, that kind of metaphysical commitment works with an epistemology to support a value framework of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and so on. So if you, though, start at the other end of the spectrum, you start, as we do know, many people who are committed to a certain political program or to a certain religious program, and they are going to defend that political program or that religious program no matter what. They will find themselves, to the extent that they are thoughtful, attacking everything in that chain of argument that you just developed. So if your position is the individual has to be respected morally and politically, if I'm already committed to a religious viewpoint that says no, I want I want individuals to be tools, to be servants of God, or servants of the church, or servants of religion, or whatever. Fundamentally, you should be in a servitude relationship. Then, to the extent that I am a philosophical person, I need to find a way to undercut that individual's self-agency and that individual's ability to understand reality in its own terms. If, by contrast, I'm not religious, but I want to say, no, 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 I think that the individual belongs to the nation, and then as a strong form of nationalism, and that the government of that nation should be able to do with individuals whatever it wants, or I belong to an ethnicity, or I belong to some sort of collective, then I have to find some way of undercutting that individual's agency. So there are various ways of doing this. Some of them, not very sophisticated philosophically, but the ones I'm interested in are the philosophers who do come up with very sophisticated arguments to undercut individualism, and almost always, as you are suggesting, they end up undercutting the individual's cognitive access to reality.
So when they do this kind of attacks, eventually they are making a moral claim that our life doesn't belong to us, it belongs to someone else, and therefore society can decide for the greater good what can be done with me. So what would be the necessary standard for objective morality, and how can we establish a proof for objective morality when we don't put God into the picture, and we don't get our rights from a collective of people represented by some politicians? Can
Yeah.
it be done?
I think, oh yes, absolutely. And I think that's one of the great achievements of the modern world, to say that precisely we can embark on that project, or then just to say to naturalize the concept of values. So if you take the concept of value, for much of human philosophical history, there was a kind of debate that said, well, values seem somewhat mysterious. If I want to say something is good or bad, right? Well, what out there in reality is good or bad? So you're looking at something right now, and I can say, well, I can see that there's some white here, there's some yellow here. I can do that. So there are some sounds here. I could taste various things, so I know what all of this sensory input is. But what am I looking at if I want to say that's good? And it's not a color, it's not a shape, it's not a distance, it's not a sound, it's not a taste, it's not a texture. So it doesn't seem like I sense this sort of thing. So it seems to be an unusual kind of property. And then the two follow-up answers are then to say, well, that's because good and bad are not natural properties of the world. They are imposed from a supernatural source. So God legislates them, and the reason why you can't see them is because the gods or God, so they are a supernatural property that we're supposed to try to embody to some extent in the natural world. And then on the other side of the divide, people who have the same problem, they would say, well, I don't see goodness in the world or smell or taste goodness in the world, but I can't believe that there are gods or a God who's legislating these things. So it must be that subjectively I am importing goodness or badness into the world, that I just am in a certain emotional state, or I have certain desires, and so I project that onto the world. So we have then some kind of strong subjectivism versus some kind of strong, maybe religious intrinsicism. So if we then want to get past that impasse, so to speak, and I think then we have to say, well, no, in some sense, the goodness or badness of things is part of the natural order of things, and that's a deep project. Now, when I talk about this issue, I always like to say human beings are very complicated. The way we should start this discussion is by starting with simpler examples, and this is kind of a good philosophical principle in general. Go for simpler cases and work your way up to the more complicated cases. So what I like to think of is, say, I don't know, I'm born in Canada, so I'm going to choose a good Canadian example. Right? So, and a non-human example. Let's think about a polar bear. And these are the large bears that live in the far north of Canada and so forth. And they have the white fur, and they're all white and so forth. And they're a very powerful predator. They can hunt very effectively and so on. So the question then is going to be, suppose we are looking at polar bears, but we are studying polar bears from a natural science perspective. And we start observing the polar bear, and we say, wow, it's a big animal. And it's very cold up in the Arctic. And how is this animal going to survive in the cold? And we say, well, it has, on the one hand, a lot of dense blubber under its skin, and that blubber insulates it against the cold. And it also has several layers of fur at different levels, lengths that provide very good insulation. And also, we notice that this fur is white, so that the polar bear matches its surrounding, because the polar bear has certain needs. It has nutritional needs. It needs to be able to hunt seals and walruses or whatever. And in order to do so, it needs to be able to have camouflage so that it can get close to the animal. It also has a strong nose, so it can detect chemical structures, and it's able to swim quite effectively, and it has claws and big teeth and so on. Now, all I'm doing so far is giving a scientific, naturalistic description of the lifestyle of the polar bear in terms of white, blubber, environment. It has certain nutritional needs. The fact that there are animals out there like seals that are a potential food resource. So I'm just doing a scientific description of the lifestyle of the polar bear. Now, suppose we then intervened as human beings. We took a tranquilizer gun and we went up to the Arctic and we found a polar bear, and we shot the polar bear with the tranquilizer gun and put it to sleep. And then while the bear was sleeping, what we did was we shaved off all of its fur. So it no longer has any fur, shaved it right down to the skin. And we also took the polar bear's claws and we clipped all of the claws, and we took its teeth and we filed down its teeth until it was blunt. So we do all of that. Now here's the hard philosophical question. Does it make sense to say that would be bad for the polar bear? I think the natural answer to that question is to say that would be bad for the polar bear. But now notice that we have introduced a normative concept. We're saying that is bad for the polar bear. And it's not a great mystery to say why that would be bad for the polar bear. And if you look at the two traditional philosophical answers, it's not that God has ordained that the polar bear must have long white fur, and you have violated God's commandment, therefore you have done something bad for the polar bear. It also is not the case that, oh, I have a subjective preference. I like polar bears to have long white fur, and so you are just violating my subjective preferences with respect to the polar bear. Instead, by using this concept of bad for the polar bear, what you are doing is you are saying, objectively, the polar bear has certain needs. It needs nutrition. And objectively, a seal is a resource in the environment for the polar bear. That's an objective fact. Objectively, the fur on the polar bear protects the polar bear from the extreme cold, so that its metabolic functions and so forth can still be done. That is an objective fact. And it disguises the polar bear from the seals so that it can hunt effectively. So if you take away the polar bear's white fur, then objectively you are making it difficult to impossible for the polar bear to survive as a polar bear in nature. So when we are using good and bad language, and we're using it very naturally here, right? Seals are good for the polar bear. White fur is good for the polar bear. Lots of blubber is good for the polar bear. What we are doing is making a complex relational statement between the polar bear's needs, its capacities, resources in the environment, how all of those have to interact so that the polar bear can stay alive as a polar bear. Now, with that in place, and if we are willing to make that move, then we are introducing good and bad value language naturalistically and scientifically into our discussions. Then it's just a case of then saying, well, different animals have different needs and capacities and resources, and human beings are a kind of animal, and it's going to be a more complicated story, but we would scale that story up. Now, on this, philosophers in the modern world who have started down this road would include people like
Philippa Foot, no?
Philippa Foot is certainly the most recent in 2001, the generation before Ayn Rand, and then to some extent also in the earlier generation, you can see people like Friedrich Nietzsche with his naturalized ethics, John Stuart Mill to some extent with a naturalized ethics, Sidgwick and others. So I see it as an ongoing scientific project.
I understand. So, um, about art, this is something that really matters to me. I'm a huge fan of classical music, especially Baroque music. And
Ah,
when I look today at listen today to music, and I see painting and even architecture, it seems to me like there is some kind of detachment from reality, and it seems like those counter Enlightenment philosophies are at the base of the art that we see today. So,
yes.
is the art a projection of this kind of philosophies today?
I think yes. I think it's both a projection of those philosophies. Toward the beginning of our interview, I said one prominent interior strand of Western civilization is people who are anti-civilization. So these would include artists who can look at the great traditions of Western art and even world art, see what's been accomplished in painting and sculpture and music, and they hate it for various reasons, and they want to destroy it. And one way of destroying it is just outright destruction of the art. And so you have people who are, throwing paint on other paintings, who are taking sledgehammers to various things. That is a nihilism in practice. But then when you also look at the history through 20th century and on into the 21st century, what we call the postmodern art world, you have very educated people who are in very sophisticated ways proclaiming that they hate that tradition and they want to subvert all of its elements. Of course, one way of doing that is by replacing the good stuff with crap or whatever anti stuff that you are interested in the museums and so forth. Or to take a classical music example, you're familiar, of course, with John Cage and the
Mm.
433. Right? So if you think of the long, just what that means symbolically, to say, we have this long tradition of beautiful music, powerful music that has been created 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s. And because it is so magnificent, right, we want to build temples, so to speak, for this music. So great symphony halls. And we want to make it a special evening where women will dress up beautifully and men will put on their suits or even their tuxedos. And we are going to enjoy this wonderful, exalted experience in a beautiful place to celebrate this achievement. So to have someone come out, right, and then say, with all of that expectation, and in the middle of that, just say, I am going to give you silence intentionally for over 4 minutes, that's making a statement. I would prefer nothingness to actually creating music. And that flouting nothingness, well, the Latin for nothing is nihil. This is
Mhm.
an explicit
Nihilism.
nihilism, right? It's an in your face. And there are variations of it in sculpture. There are artists, I'll put it in scare quotes, who will do replicas of famous statues. So you take, say, the Venus de Milo, the representation of the kind of the ideal feminine beauty from the classical Greek world. So I'll do a reproduction version of the Venus de Milo and then do it as a kind of performance art. So there's the statue over there. But I, the artist, and it's a female artist as it happens, will go to the other end of the room with a gun, a real gun with real bullets, and I will shoot the Venus de Milo, bang, 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 to shoot it. So that's an explicit anti lots and lots of things and in your face. So yes, I think it's not just that you have lots of people who prefer old style Gothic art or tribal art and so forth. We have a large number of people who are anti all art and they would like to destroy it. So that's part of the emptiness of one significant subsector in our culture.
Can I have time for one last question, please?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay, so what is it about Western civilization and the Enlightenment and all those beautiful pro-life philosophies that we have that is so vulnerable to this multi-layered attack of what you spoke about? And how
Yeah,
can we basically protect ourselves from all the future attacks that I'm sure are going to continue to come in different forms because they are relentless, those
yeah.
philosophers?
No, that's a deep question. That's a hard question. I think that one that has to inform our strategy. I want to say there's two things here. I think one is the philosophical line. I think there are people, for whatever reason, they begin, who convince themselves to become skeptics, to become cynics, to become advocates of values that are anti-civilizational at various points. So I think it is possible for people to talk themselves into being anti-civilizational for philosophical reasons. I think another starting point, though, is that there are people who are not necessarily philosophers at the beginning, but they do start off with a psychological weakness, a psychological vulnerability in varying degrees. And rather than working to correct that psychological problem, they adopt ideologies that indulge their psychological problem. So that if for whatever reason, we might then say, or just this is just one example, just to focus on economic issues, we might say, in modern scientific, technological, capitalist society, it's very progressive. But if I am going as a young adult to enter into the workplace and live the best life, then I need to learn some science and technology. I need to become entrepreneurial and develop my skill set. And that sounds like a certain amount of character work and a certain amount of intellectual work. But suppose that for whatever reason, psychologically, I'm a teenager and I don't want to do that. I hate science. I hate math. I don't like technology. It just sounds too much work. I want to have money, but I don't want to have to be an entrepreneur. I don't have to work up my skill set. So for whatever reason, psychologically, I look at this modern world and it seems too scary, too demanding for me. And so what I then will do is, if I don't want to fix myself, I will find a philosophy that rationalizes my incapacity to meet the demands as I see them of the modern world. So, and I think that is a significant also number of people as well. So this is not necessarily a sophisticated philosophical route to hating the scientific, technological, entrepreneurial, capitalist world. It's a personal weakness. I am not up to the task. And so I simply am opposed to it because it makes me feel bad about myself. It puts demands on me. It's going to tell me that since I'm not going to be an entrepreneur or a scientist, that I'm going to be in my 40s or 50s still working some minimum wage dead end job, and society is going to treat me like a loser. I don't want to think of myself as a loser, so I'm going to just reject that entire society that's going to take me down that path. So what we need to do about that then, I think, is approach it from both sides. I think one side is we do need better philosophy. I think the Enlightenment and modernity has been a great success. It does have some philosophical vulnerabilities that have been exploited. So I do think it's part of my job as a philosopher and other modern Enlightenment philosophers to keep working on that project and strengthen the weaker parts of the Enlightenment philosophy. The other part of the project, I think, is parenting and schooling, because if we are creating in each generation teenagers and late teenagers who do not feel up to the task of entering with a sense of fun and adventure this beautiful world with so many opportunities, if instead they're scared of that world and feeling that they are not capable of functioning in it, that's a problem of parenting and a problem of schooling, one or the other, or jointly. So we need to have better parenting training, better parenting commitment, and I think certainly informal schooling some evolutions in a healthy direction, and a whole lot of experimental entrepreneurism to reform education.
I see. Well, unfortunately, I have to let you go. I must
Yeah.
tell you that listening to you, learning from you is so enriching.
Well,
And
thanks
from
for that.
the bottom of my heart, I appreciate your work. I learned so much from you, even my
Mm.
daughter. Thank you very, very much.
All right.
Um,
No, I
so, I,
appreciate the opportunity. Great questions, and yeah, we will follow up.
yes, thank you,
All
sir.
right.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Bye for
I
now.
mean, good morning. Bye bye.